come to the main item this afternoon, and I'm pleased to be able to ask or introduce our speaker to you. You've heard him before. He's given several talks here, and if you remember, the last talk he gave was entitled the Arnolfini Portrait, and he dealt with these painters of that. It was tremendous and was very, very well received. And I'm sure he's going to be up to that standard this afternoon when he talks to us about the history of Venice. And he's going to cover that for a very long period. So I'm going to ask him now, without much ado, to come forward and address you on the history of Venice. Thank you, Geoff.
Thank you, Handel. Can I be heard if I'm standing this far back from the microphone? I've got to be here, have I? Right. This is a history of Venice. It's not the history. We haven't enough time left in this century probably to do that. And what I'm going to be talking about principally is Venice city itself, the principal island of Venice. So it's that bit there. A little reference to the Lido. And just for interest, this is out of the National Geographic. There are some wonderful shots from the air from satellites of all over the world, and that's rather a good one of Venice. And number 6 there, which most people don't visit, is a very, very large industrial area. And if you were standing to the northeast of Venice and looked across the lagoon 30 years ago, you'd have seen oil refineries and huge industrial complexes, most of which now are gone. So this is the bit I'm going to be talking about, and it splits into what are called cistieri. There are 6 of those, and we can come back to those in the course of the talk. Now, all sources are unreliable, or at least disagree on how many islands there are. But I've settled for 121, because that's what an official Italian government website says there are. Most other references, especially on the internet, say there are 118. It's quite irrelevant, really. Lots of canals and lots of bridges, and about 1800 years of history. Of the last 300 or 400 years of history, however, it's been said that if someone was last there in 1600 and they turned up today, they wouldn't find very much has changed. The painting in the centre is by Canaletto, and the photograph could be part of a photograph taken by any one of millions and millions of people who have visited the place. So whoever goes would easily find their way around. And these are some very topical images of Venice, and I'll show a few slides of these before we get into the history itself. The Mask of Carnevale is very, very popular, going on at the moment, flooded. So if you're thinking of going to Carnevale sometime, take Wellington boots. The thing I'm highlighting there is a sponsorship, is an advertising board outside St. Mark's. And one of the things that's happening to Venice, it's becoming more and more commercial, and more very large worldwide sponsors are getting interested in sponsoring events because it attracts so many people. 20 million people a year visit Venice. That's the number for about 18 months ago. It's probably climbing all the time. And I like the one of the snow because it does enjoy the 4 seasons like most of Europe. So it's a place you can visit any time of the year. Now, Carnevale's got a very long history. It goes back, as you can see, to 1162. It was stopped by the Doge in 1700 because of the increase in venereal disease. People were taking advantage of the fact that they were masked and generally going out on the razzle and over-enjoying themselves. So it was stopped. But in 1979 it was restarted when the city authorities thought, hang on, this is another way of bringing tourists in. And there were 3 million tourists who came just for that event last year. Some more shots of Venice, very common, very popular pictures. And it was said that, I'll show you, this bleep is getting on my nerves. This here was, when that was designed, it was designed as a stage set. That the stage set was to be framed by the two columns and the piazza. The horses, the bronze horses above the entrance to St. Mark's, very, very popular. They're not the originals, they're replicas. And the Bridge of Sighs was named by Lord Byron, who also said, and he was a bit of a lad, that Venetian women kissed better than any others. Now to the history. These things are amphora, and they were used to store and transport something like a fish soup. And they're the earliest artifacts that have been found about Venice. And it's generally thought that Venice was founded about 421, when people were escaping from invading forces in Europe and coming across the salt marshes in flat-bottomed boats to get to the islands that were there originally. And I think someone claims that was the 25th of March. How they know, I'm not entirely sure. But of the 121 or 122 islands, every one of them has a church. Every parish has a church. The trading post was established in 421. The first Doge was elected that long ago. I'm going to have to move this, I'm afraid. Then Saint Theodore was the patron saint of Venice, but when the bones reputed to be of Saint Mark were acquired by Venice, he was pretty unceremoniously dumped. And they set out to build a wonderful basilica. But just before that, they stole the bronze horses from Constantinople. They did a deal with Constantinople which enlarged their trade with the rest of the world. And then some years later they did the dirty on them and stole the bronze horses. Now what's it built on? Much of Venice, the 122 islands, are natural islands. But much of the building there is built on wooden piles. And that's the key thing about the wood is, if it's exposed to air, then it deteriorates. But if it's immersed in salt water, particularly, it turns almost into stone. So once the piles have been driven and stay immersed, then there's no reason it shouldn't go on for a long, long time. And this is an early shot showing how they did it. These are some examples in the museum, one of the museums in Venice, which if you touch them you realise they're virtually stone. And the church there was said to be built on 1 million piles. So imagine how much wood was stripped out from the surrounding countryside to build this place. And that's what happens if they're exposed to air. Exposed to water, it's as good as concrete. Now exposing things to air, including the foundations of the buildings, is clearly tricky. And this is what a canal looks like when it's empty of water. So to maintain the services, all the utilities run in the canals. Sewerage, water, electricity, gas, whatever. And if there's a problem with any of those, then they block the canal with something like a lock gate, drain it, work in it as quickly as they can because they don't want the air to get at the foundations or the timber, and then fill it with water again. So that's going on around the city all the time. And some of the reasons you see no entry signs to the small canals is that they've been blocked. Other times it's because it's a one-way canal, they're too narrow for two-way traffic. But you can see what happens to foundations. It's just the effect of the water bashing away at these things. And I'll come back to that in much more detail later on. So the great columns were erected in 1171, and much of what was there was stolen. But that's the history of Europe, really. And Napoleon crops up a little later on in this story because he was one of the great thieves of that particular century. The earliest reference to private banks, this was a terrific trading nation. At one point it was the second richest nation in the world, the city of Venice. So clearly there had to be banking, there had to be lines of credit, people had to be trusted, and one way to do that was to have a recognised banking system. The Doge's palace was built in 1340. Then the plague comes along in 1348 and wipes out a great chunk of the population. Painting on canvas was discovered. Until then, most painting had been done on wood panels. But the Venetians had 30-odd thousand ships at this point, and their sail canvas was the best canvas in the world. And someone thought that would be a nice medium to paint on, might be easier than wood. And virtually since that time, the majority of the world's painters have worked on canvas. And they got the first printing press in Italy. They're a very innovative lot. They also invented double entry bookkeeping, and that was to do with the banking system that they had. And a textbook was published. The first textbook on double entry bookkeeping was published by the Venetians, but it's thought that bookkeeping was invented about 200 years before that. Bellini became a key figure in the development of the Renaissance in the place. Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, and then with the discovery by the Portuguese of India and so on, trading routes began to open up much more broadly around the world, and that led to the beginning of the decline of Venice as a trading nation. And as you can see, those two fonts that we all use today if you do anything with the computing and word processing documents, there are hundreds and hundreds of fonts. These two were invented by the Venetians. So we're up to 1494, and this is a very famous picture from 1494 by Carpaccio. And it's got a number of interesting features. One is, that's the original Rialto Bridge. It was a wooden bridge, unsurprisingly. On the rooftops, you'll see there are some platforms. You just make those out, and I'll come back to those in a while. But something that you won't easily be able to make out from here is that one of the gondoliers is a Negro, and it's this chap here. Venice was also a centre for slavery. It was the gateway to Europe for the slave trade. So unsurprising that they'd have been employed or kept in Venice, and there were many, many thousands of them passing through Venice to other parts of Europe. And it's called the miracle, the painting is the miracle of the relic of the cross. And there are said to have been more miracles happened in Venice than any other city in Europe, with the possible exception of Rome. And it's also said that it's a miracle that Venice has survived in the place that it is, in the condition that it sits. Now, this isn't the first Doge, but it's one of the most recognisable paintings of a Doge by Bellini, and I think it's a wonderful picture. And you can think of the Doge as a sort of chairman of the board, and the Grand Council was the extended board, but the only people who sat in the Grand Council were well connected, much like the Conservative government. Grumble, grumble, grumble from the
U3A, you mean?
Oh yes, the U3A. But they decided everything that went on, and there were a small number of very influential families that ran Venice for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Doge was something of a ceremonial figure as well as being chairman of the board, but interestingly, he was not allowed to travel without the permission of the Grand Council, which was very sparingly granted. He wasn't allowed to own property. He wasn't allowed to receive gifts. So he was kept in a very privileged and isolated position, but a man of fantastic influence. And then there are some developments in painting and so on. But a lot of what you see in the Doge's palace today dates from this time, 1600s. Now these are not letterboxes as we normally think of letterboxes. They are to denounce people. They're an ability to anonymously denounce neighbours, people you don't like, or whatever. And you see these around Venice, and one or two of them are in the Doge's palace, and they're for different things. So this one might be for adultery, for instance. This one might be because they think someone's evading tax. But the system was built on, the council ran Venice on the basis of intense secrecy. If you were one of the connected families, you knew what was going on and you were part of it. If you weren't, you were in the dark. And there were more policemen per head of population than anywhere else in the world, probably ever. There was one policeman for every 200 or so citizens. And if you add to that this secrecy, and that you could denounce people, maybe for advantage, maybe you made it up, it didn't matter. There was an anonymous way of doing that. So you could almost think of this as a police state. But at the same time they were running this police state, they were able to put up buildings like this. Dates from 1514. It's one of the images of Venice that everyone recognises from all over the world. And just a year or two later, they established the first ghetto in Europe. Now, ghetto, G-E-T-O, is a Venetian dialect word for a foundry. And when they decided that they ought to try and contain the Jewish population, because they were nervous about the influence they might have, their ability in business, money lending and so on, that they'd contain them in a part of the city. And they chose the site of a rundown iron foundry, which was a ghetto, and hence the name. Now there are some statistics for this, and I need to find my notes. There were 700 Jews in Venice at the time. It had canals on two sides, two heavy gates on the other two sides, manned by Christian guards, paid for by the Jewish population. Wasn't disbanded until 1797 when Napoleon came along and said, that's got to stop. But they didn't get full freedom in the Italian system until unification with the rest of Italy. Now, Venetian law forbade the building of separate synagogues. And Jewish law says there can't be anything between a synagogue and the sky. So the synagogues were built on the rooftops. That's one. And that's, you can see, that's where it is if you go to Venice. Nice part of town, fairly quiet, becoming popular with tourists, especially with the Holocaust celebrations, if I can call them that, of the last couple of years. More and more people are visiting, restaurants are opening and so on. So what was a pretty rundown and poor part of Venice is on the up. So I'm at 1531 now, and that's what two mapmakers thought in the 1550s and the 1560s. First one was an Ottoman admiral, trade with Constantinople, constant toing and froing of seamen from that part of the world into Venice. They needed to map it. The second one is the much more recognizable to us of Venice as we see it today. And I don't know who drew the map, but it was published by an Italian publishing company. Now this is a very, very old photograph, and it's wonderfully atmospheric. and it makes the point about it being designed as a stage set, effectively. And at the time this was taken, which I think is the mid to late 1800s, I can't find out precisely, St. Mark's Square was said to be the finest drawing room in Europe. I think this was at the time of the Grand Tour, and wealthy people were flocking in to the place, and it was a terrific place to meet. Then the Rialto Bridge comes along. The wooden one had burned down, so they built a new one. And it was only 4 years after it was built that the famous quote appears in one of Shakespeare's plays. So he certainly had his finger on the pulse. 4 years after it was finished, it's in one of his stories. And this is a caution. I think it's a caution about be careful on the steps, you might fall over. It's also a caution about be careful on the canal side, especially if you had something to drink, because this is not a smart place to fall in the water. And you may have read that, I think in 2013, a tourist fell from one of the ferry boats and was crushed. Fell in the canal and was drunk. So it's rare, but it's something to guard against. So my recommendation would be, especially if it's wet, with all that marble around, and you've had a bit to drink, stay indoors. Now I included this one because before I started preparing this was an artist I'd never heard of. And he did a fabulous picture of the Rialto Bridge. Sorry, of the Bridge of Sighs, but I couldn't, other than in a reference book, I couldn't find it anywhere on the internet. But he's got a wonderful style, Sir Francis Barry. And he produced hundreds and hundreds of works around the place. Very milky sort of finish. And so I included it because I liked it. Now, this is also a very famous image from Carnival and the fancy masks and all the rest of it. And the origin of this goes back to the plague. That mask was worn by people who treated the sick, worked with the sick, transported the sick during the plague. And the nose was stuffed with herbs, other vegetables, cloths, dipped in all sorts of things as an attempt, because they didn't understand, an attempt to keep the plague away from the person wearing the mask. A modern surgical mask might just about do it today, because some of the plague is passed by just vapour from nostrils and so on. But mostly it's passed by flea bites. And the plague at this stage wiped out about a third of the population. And that's why it's called the Black Death. If you've got it, you don't half know it. Now, Dr. Parry at the back might want to add something when you're having your slice of cake, but perhaps not. But when the plague eventually passed, they were so pleased that only half the population had been killed by this disease that they built this church as a way of saying thank you. And in 2004, on this little island here, just off Lido, not much visited, they found the remains of a mass grave of about 15,000 people who'd been buried there. And Laretia was a colony, what do they call it, when they contain people, like an isolation island. If you had the plague or were suspected of having the plague, you were shipped off to this island. And a doctor from Padua said at the time that this was a thoroughly good idea, and that if you survived, then you were okay and you could come back. But otherwise you died. If you died, you had it, and if you survived, you could come back. You could argue that if you were suspected of having it and you were confined in this place, your chances of getting it rocketed. So it's a bit like in Tibet, hundreds of years ago, the criminal justice system was, you had a trial, and if you were found guilty, you were lobbed off a cliff, a 3,000-foot vertical drop. and if you survived, they were wrong. Now, Venice is sort of regarded as owned by the world, not just by Italy. And there is interest in it in hundreds of languages. I don't know how many languages there are in the world, but probably more than 200 or 300. And you can find something in most of those languages about Venice. This is from a German magazine, and I used it because it's the first time that I found something that talked about their early attempts to control the flooding in the city. So it's been a problem for hundreds and hundreds of years, flooding. And this is it. In the 17th century, they diverted the river over this side and the river here, that instead of emptying into the lagoon, they entered the Adriatic. So that's long been a problem. They've long tried to do something about it, and they still are trying to do something about it, and I'll cover that in a few minutes. But I found it interesting that when I was Googling Venice, you can Google it and you get 283,575,302 responses, and you don't read them all, frankly. But I was astonished at how many languages things popped up in. Back now to the 1700s. Canaletto gets to work. I should think everyone's familiar with his work. You go to any major gallery in the world and you find his stuff, very realistic drawings of the buildings, and they're wonderful historical documents because they're accurate about the buildings and the boats and whatever. In 1744 they started the first work on trying to do something better about the flooding problem. Guardi arrived and started painting, and Goethe made his wonderful quote that Venice can only be compared with itself. Napoleon comes along and deposes the Doge. That's the end of the Doges. Then when he gets tired of it, he hands it over to Austria-Hungary, and eventually it becomes part of Italy. And on their honeymoon in Venice, George Eliot's husband either fell from or threw himself from a balcony into the Grand Canal and drowned. And it is said that this was because he discovered that marriage involved sex. Poor chap. Now, I told you this was built in 1514, and you'd think, oh well, it's done well, it's been there 600 years. Well, the truth is it hasn't, because in 1912 it fell down. And it's reported to have fallen like a gentleman, however that is. This photograph is almost certainly a fake. You imagine cameras at the time and someone just coming out of the corner from the coffee shop and going, oh, it wasn't quite like that at the time. But there's no doubt that these are authentic. Happily, there was only one casualty when this thing fell down like a gentleman, and it was the caretaker's cat. Oh, I knew you'd say that. And no one, it's not recorded anywhere what the cat's name was. No. What can you say? But they rebuilt it. And it's as perfect a copy as you can imagine. They even used the same bells that were in the tower. The biggest bell of the lot wasn't damaged in the collapse. Must have been very well made. But the decoration on this just mimics the original one. And again, someone going back to Venice after 500 years would come around the corner, St. Mark's Square, and say, oh yeah, I've seen that before, and walk on. But that's typical of the whole of Venice, much of Venice, the facades, the marble frontages to all the buildings and so on. It's been a deliberate policy for hundreds of years for nothing to change, because that's what brings people in. And every now and again, and in fact there's a very modern hotel just off St. Mark's Square, which looks like one of these concrete 1960s buildings. And it sort of jars, but sort of doesn't either. But if you stand there, it does look out of place compared with everything else. And it's one of the few things that someone coming back after 500 years would say, oh, I don't remember that. So, back to the history of it. Who's seen the film Death in Venice? Gosh, I can recommend the rest of you see it. Not much is said. It's very light. If they're paid by words in the script, it's one of the most highly paid films in the world. But it is a fascinating story, and it's set on the Lido, which is the sort of beach resort of Venice. And it captures the mood and the atmosphere perfectly well at that time, I think. Charlie Chaplin comes along, makes a film. First World War was a pretty quiet affair for the Italians. They were on our side. And that's a very rare photograph of sailors on the Grand Canal with a warship moored. But very quickly after the war, the tourists come back. And they come back in their thousands. The causeway was built in 1932, and it's a genuine lifeline for Venice, and even more so today. Opened by Mussolini. The following year, Hitler came to meet Mussolini in Venice and came across the causeway, because I came by train. There were some deportations from the ghetto in 1944 and 1945, and the implication is that the Italians fought off any earlier attempts to deport people, but by 1944 they didn't have much choice. They weren't so much an ally then as an occupied country. And I think of the 2,000 Jews who were there at the time, 247 were deported and 8 came back. But very quickly after the war, tourism bounces back. And Venice is very much, it's business for business for business. And they had a very early diplomatic service. They were straddling the line between East and West, and they thought that war was bad for business. And so they established very early on a very effective diplomatic service. And a British ambassador to Venice said that an ambassador was an honest man sent abroad to lie for his country. And that's true today, probably. Now, I mentioned the platform in the bridge, in the picture about the miracle. Now, this is a photograph that I took from the balcony of an apartment that my wife and I rented 2 years ago in Venice. And someone going back after 500 years would say, well, not much has changed. As if they didn't notice the TV aerials. But the thing that they would notice are the platforms. And it's such a congested place that if you want some fresh air, you're not going to find it down at the canal side. So people built these things, almost as sun loggers, up on their rooftops. And another very unusual thing in Venice is a garden. There were thousands of gardens 100 years ago, much more than 100 years ago. Casanova complained when he was there that there were many fewer gardens than there used to be. Presumably so you could chase ladies around bushes or whatever. And that was a garden that I photographed from the other part of the balcony on this, in this apartment we rented. And this building here, the top floor, was a music school. So you could sit on the balcony at breakfast in the morning and listen to the students across the canal. And in the evening, you could hear the gondoliers going past singing, because this was at a crossroads of two canals. Lovely spot, not far from, just across the main canal from the ghetto, about a 5-minute walk from one of the Vaporetto stops. That's it in daylight, and you can see the canal, and then there was a canal ran that way. I think there are 46 gardens left in Venice. Now, the next most obvious icon of Venice is the gondola. The current design dates from about 1900 or so. They weigh about 3/4 of a ton when they've got 3 or 4 people in them, and a single gondolier can propel one very, very easily. If you watch a gondolier at work, it's... How are you doing? You know, looks all very leisurely. It's very clever, but it's all pretty leisurely. It's flat-bottomed, and the very early boats that they used in Venice, apart from when they started building canals, canals aren't very deep, had to be flat, shallow, not take very much draft. And that was one of the things that stopped invasion from the mainland, in that anyone coming in a major fleet, the canals were too narrow, their boats unmanageable in the lagoon, and that gave them a degree of protection. And there's an element of that design carried forward for hundreds and hundreds of years. These things are flat-bottomed, don't take much water. Even when they're full, they're very heavy. They weigh about 1/4 of a ton when they're empty. And there's celebrity boats, of course. And there's Gandhi, and I've forgotten his name. What's his name? Humphrey Bogart, well done, and Lauren Bacall. But you see them all over the place. George Clooney, you might have noticed, not being a traditionalist, went chasing up the Grand Canal in a motorboat. But it was a beautiful object of a motorboat. As much of a beautiful object as gondolas, in my opinion. Now the fraud in this picture, which you've all spotted, is this one. Doesn't quite look like Venice somehow, does it? Well, that's the Grand Canal in the Venetian Hotel, and there's one in Las Vegas, and there's one in Macau. And they cheat because they're not propelled by oars. They have a little battery-powered engine and a propeller. There's a propeller just under there. So they use the oar for steering. But it is a curious thing that an American hotelier would put a canal that contains 60 million gallons of water on the 3rd floor. Waterproofing's come a long way. Now, one of the really interesting things about the design of these things is that they're wider on one side than they are on the other. Whoops. See, it's wider there. That's from the back. This is from the front. And that's so that they can be steered from propelled and steered from one side. Because if you push against it, the shape of the boat is going to be pushing against you. Normally, if you're rowing a boat, you pull the two together. Or if you're paddling a canoe, you do this and that, and that's to keep it straight. They solve that problem by making it wider one side than the other and slowing down one side, so that if you're pushing, it's going in a straight line. This chap's a novice, I think. I'm not sure that's in the book of how to steer one of these things. But this piece of timber that the oar stands in is a work of art by itself. It's called a porthcawl. And they're handmade, and they're shaped, beautifully shaped. So these are for different heights. They're made to measure virtually, but if you've got a gondola that's used by more than one gondolier, and they're of different heights, they need to stack the oar in a different place. And they're polished and with linseed oil and wax and all sorts of things to preserve them. So they're wonderful things. If you're pushing, you use this side, and if you're using it as a brake, then you just bring the oar over the back and pull against you. So you push if you're going, and then you pull it from the back. And the oar itself is a clever piece of construction, and a design that hasn't changed in a long, long time. And another characteristic is the prow, this iron at the front. And it's got 6 of these things on it, it is said, one for each sestieri. But the design of these was rationalised in the 16th century. They began to become very ornate. People were showing off. My gondola is better than your gondola. Look at this. And they were having a scrap with someone at the time, and they wanted to use all the metal they could for the manufacture of guns. So they proscribed the style of this and said, that's what you can have. And the rest of it we'll have for making weaponry. And you can see how, you can see how large they are. And they can weigh 100 weight, these things. And again, beautifully made, handcrafted. And gondolas are also quite highly decorated, some of them. And they're all painted black, you'll have noticed. Again, that was standardised in about the 18th century. Again, to stop this over-elaboration and people saying, well, I've got a red one and you've got a yellow one, or whatever. So they're standardised, and also, if they're scraped and involved in a bump, they're easier to repair, you just repaint them with black. And some of the ornamentation here is terrific. So if you're wandering around the place, it's worth just having a coffee and watching these things and study them for a bit. And then cabins came along. This one is a hearse. This is a very elaborate one. That's where they started. And it is said that gondoliers knew more about Venetian women than did their husbands. This is one that was made for the royal family in the 1930s, and it's in one of the galleries in Venice. And the blinds started off being curtains, then they were wooden slats, and they became Venetian blinds. So not only do we have fonts, but double entry bookkeeping and Venetian blinds, all thanks to these chaps. Now, when I started researching this, I discovered that only 4 manufacturers, I think it's 4 or 5, manufacturers of these things left. There were 10,000 of them at one time. And as you can see, that 8 different sorts of wood used. Each wood is chosen for a very specific reason and for a very specific purpose. And these things are hand-built today. And the Tramontine website is a shrine to craftsmanship, in my opinion. It's a lovely work of art by itself. Now, I don't know if this is one of their workshops or their workshop. I photographed this on the way back from a long lunch that we had. It's not far from Academia. And it was just across a narrow canal. And there are about 440 gondoliers today, and they have to be licensed individually. And how many of you been to Dublin? How long did you have to wait for taxi? A long time. Took a long time to get into the city. The Dublin Taxi Drivers Association limits the number of taxis. The taxi licence costs about 40 or 50,000 euros in Dublin, but when you come to sell them, they're worth a fortune. And most taxi drivers regard the licence as their pension fund, and they change hands for €500,000. This is no different. 40 odd gondoliers, only 8 new licences added in the last year. They're about 70,000 euros that you pay the municipality to acquire one, and presumably there's a driving lesson or pushing lesson for gondoliers. But they change hands for 700,000 euros, and they can be passed down from father to son or sold. They're very, very valuable assets. But there was a fatality last year from a gondolier, lots of accidents, and because they're all black, and you turn up at the Carabinieri and you say, I've been bumped by a gondola, and they say, well, tell me about it. You say, well, it was black. Okay, well, that narrows it down to 446 or whatever it is. So they're now going to be fixed. They're going to be given number plates effectively so that you can identify them. And that's not untypical of the sort of traffic jam you can get in some of the narrower canals at the height of the season. Now, another feature that's often overlooked in the place, you walk through a little piazza, is the well. And that's, for obvious reasons, that's where they got their water from. And these are works of art, so stonemason's art, ironmaster's art. They've all got a very heavy cast iron lid, often very ornate. And this became the sort of meeting place for each parish, and every piazza had one. So that's where people went to draw the water, that's where they went to find out what was going on. But they stopped using them as soon as Venice was connected to the mains water supply, because they realised that drawing water from the wells was lowering the water table, which was increasing the flooding problem when that came along. But you see them, most squares will have one tucked away somewhere. and they're lovely, lovely things. This one was in a square just around the corner from this apartment we had. Smashing restaurant there, I could recommend it, but I can't remember either the name of the piazza or the restaurant. But we were partway through supper one evening, and some chaps came along with what looked like a sound system on a trolley, and they plonked it down and they plugged it into the mains, and somebody else brought along some speakers, and within 20 minutes there was the weekly tango dance taking place, and people were coming along with their little bags, changing their shoes, and off they were. It was absolutely wonderful atmosphere, and obviously everybody local knew about it. And terrific quality dancing, smashing time. Now, there is no supermarket in Venice. There are lots of corner shops. Everything has to come in by boat or across the causeway, and then once it arrives at the station, everything has to be transported by boat, and then by men with trolleys over bridges, up steps, and all the rest of it. So food's quite expensive, and if you want to do any amount of shopping, then you cross the causeway and go to Marghera. That's the nearest supermarket. But also, Italy has the lowest share of ownership of freezers in Europe. Now that's partly because after the war, it took a long, long time to develop a robust enough electricity system that you could power more than a light bulb in each house. But that's still the case. Supermarkets are not as common in Italy anywhere as they are anywhere else in Europe. But in Venice particularly so. So it's brought in across the causeway or by train, but it arrives at the terminal, and then bigger boats take it up the bigger canals, and then little boats take it up to the smaller canals, and eventually a porter comes along with a trolley. But also, the rubbish has to be collected. Now, we were only there for a week, so I don't know whether they collect every other Friday like we do in Porthcawl or whatever, but everything has to be carried to a boat and then taken away from Venice itself. So there's the sestieri, and there's 6 of them. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is the numbering system for the houses. They do not have streets. Houses are numbered starting at 1 in some corner of one of these, and then it goes round until they've all got a number. So they can go up to 6,000 or 7,000. And presumably the postman knows where they are. But if someone said to you, well, I'm staying at 177 Via Gellia, for instance, you think, oh, that's pretty easy, I might find that on the map. But you'd be pretty lucky to find the property. So that's one challenge that Venice has if you're a visitor. Mostly it doesn't matter because guidebooks tell you most of what you need to know. But the other challenge they have is flooding. Now this is quite a light-hearted shot of flooding in St. Mark's Square. And that chap there is taking a photograph of the chap who's taking the photograph of him taking a photograph of her feet. It's not done by mirrors, it's all done by... But the reality is the damage that it does to the buildings, for instance, that plaster comes off the walls. And the apartment building we stayed in was an apartment on the top floor of an old palace. There were 4 floors, I think, and the ground floor was not occupied. There was a little private dock to the canal, but the ground floor wasn't occupied because regularly part of that floor flooded, so you couldn't rent it to anybody, there wasn't anything in it. It was used as storage space on platforms and so on. And that wouldn't be at all untypical if you're walking down any street in Venice, that the ground floor won't have a great deal in it. And those are some shots of what happens when it floods. You imagine filthy water in shops, in houses, in hotels, everywhere you can think of. None of this is going to be sweet smelling, you can be sure of that. And in the 1990s, there were 20 or 30 days a year of flooding. And as you can see, in 2014, They can't agree on it exactly, like the number of islands, but about 100 days of flooding. So the situation's clearly getting worse. And if the record flood is 6 feet, and usually it's 2 or 3 feet, but the record is 6. If that happened in London, I couldn't find a similar shot for Cardiff or Porthcawl. But that's what London would look like, with that level of flooding that the Venetians endure for days and days and days every year between tides. In 1971, 3 Brits, including, I knew I'd forget his name, it doesn't matter. 3 wealthy Brits decided something had to be done. The Venetians last decided something had to be done in 1744. There was an attempt to do something in just after the war, there was another attempt to do something, but they couldn't agree on what to do. And these 3 guys decided, enough's enough, the world has a responsibility for Venice, and the world has to do something about it. And there's just a few names there. UNESCO made it a World Heritage Site in 1987. I'm a member of Rotary, I'm quite pleased that we were involved in that. But there's a real alphabet soup of organisations around the world dedicated to raising money to solve the problem, to keep Venice alive for the world. And there's probably no other city in the world that has that sort of status. And Venice, well, on behalf of Venice, I should say, more money has been raised than for any other project you can think of in history. More people around the world are prepared to contribute to save Venice than any other country, any other building, any other monument, whatever. And just about every country in the world, and they'd be surprised at some of these guys. I mean, why would Syria be interested? But people go there from all over the world. It's a place that people want to visit, and it's a place that people want to save. And you won't find them saying that about a lot of other places in the world that are very visited by tourists. So, in 2003, they really decided to do something about it. And the then mayor and the city council launched this project. It's due to be finished next year. And what it involves is effectively lifting lock gates everywhere between the Adriatic and the lagoon. So there are 3 principal entrances to the lagoon, north and south of the Lido, and another one a bit further south. And the idea is that when the tide's coming in, you just raise this. They sit in lumps of concrete, like concrete beds. These things weigh 22,000 tons. And so there's 3 kilometers of these across these 3 gaps. And each of them has got one of these things. And it's designed to work up to the 6 feet record level, but only if the water on the other side is no more than 4 feet. So they're having to juggle this when it happens, and they've done some practice runs to see the technology works and so on. It's a colossal project. I lost count of how many billions are involved in this. Sadly, the mayor was arrested along the way, and so was 64 of his, I was going to say accomplices, but they haven't been found guilty yet. 64 of his mates. But it carries on, and it's due to be finished next year. And if it works, it'd be terrific. But the big concern now is, if you get 6 foot of water coming in and you're safe from that, all very well and good. But let's say you've got 4 feet of water and you raise these things so you stop the flood before it becomes a flood. But you've just had a couple of days of record rainfall coming into the lagoon. That water can't escape. So if these 2 things coincide, the fear is that it will make the flooding worse. They've yet to find out how often these things are going to coincide. But that's the big worry about this particular scheme. But it's the only scheme in town. They don't have any other way of addressing this. And the other huge challenge are the cruise ships. Has anyone been on a cruise ship going into Venice? Yes. Wonderful sight? Stunning. But sending a ship that weighs maybe 120 or 150,000 tons up the canal and the water that that's going to displace is very, very controversial. Every now and again they bump. This was a water bus, a vaporetto, that was crushed because the pilot just lost control a little bit. And there's not much you can do quickly to stop something that weighs 100,000 tons. They did put a limit of 90,000 tons on ships, which is still one great chunk of a ship, but it was overturned in the law courts on appeal. There are too many people want the millions of people that cruise ships bring into Venice, coming into Venice. It's what keeps Venice alive. 20 million visitors a year. 80% of them only stay for a day. They're day visitors. So they either come across the causeway or they come by boat. So it's an overwhelming percentage of the people who visit and therefore keep the businesses going that come on ships. So it's very, very controversial. What the City Council now would like to do is to close that canal to ships and insist that they come in at the bottom of the Lido and come up that way. But then you won't see these lovely shots from the boat of St. Mark's Square when you go to book your cruise. You'll see the railway terminal and the causeway, and just about here the remains of an oil refinery. So it's a tricky, very tricky thing for them to manage. But it does lead to some fabulous pictures. Now this is wonderful. There's an independence movement in Venice, and they built a tank, and they were going to take over the city council. And you can see that they lifted somebody's bulldozer and put a top on it, and I don't know what armaments it carried, a giant water pistol perhaps. But it was very controversial, and they drove it onto St. Mark's Square, and 20 people all milled around with flags and said, "We want independence," and they were arrested, and that was it. What surprised me when I researched this was how many countries in Europe have independence movements, and with the exception of, I think, 3, we've all got an independence movement of some sort. And we've got Plaid Cymru, the Scots, bless them, have got the SNP. Don't know what the English have got, but they don't deserve much. Oh, there are some English in the audience. Oh, you're still awake. Excellent. Needless to say, it fizzled out. There's a budding green movement, and you can buy a map from these folks now that tell you the green places to eat. It's ideal for vegetarians and people who do the most recycling and that sort of stuff. So the sort of grassroots movements, you pardon the pun, that are all over the world and not exempt. This was highly controversial. This was an office building for the Pierre Cardin company, and they wanted to build it on the mainland, just at the far end of the lagoon, of the causeway. But the worry was that this would ruin the view from the cruise ships coming into the canal, because you'd be able to see it. It's the same height as the Shard, almost to a foot. And there's said to be a montage of that skyline of St. Mark's Square with this building behind it, but I couldn't find that anywhere. But as you can see, it's an enormous, not just in height, but in every... I think it's a lovely looking building. Just rather think it might have been in the wrong place. And that was very controversial, but it never got planning permission. They battled it with the city council for about 18 months, and eventually they said no, and the Pierre Cardin company said, well, enough's enough, we'll go somewhere else. We'll build it in Dubai, probably. Now, the Italian government, like our government and like the Greek government, owes billions. So the Italian government, like many, is selling off state assets to reduce the deficit. And they discovered that they owned this island in the lagoon, which was unvisited. Nobody had been there for a long, long time, called Porthcawl. And the island I talked about earlier is just there. So this one's a bit further down the lagoon. Looks quite nice. Nice little canals, you think. Nice holiday place for an oligarch. But only one person bid for it, so it only sold for £400,000, and that was an Italian. And the guys who didn't bid for it might just have known this. it's got graves of about 50 to 70,000 plague victims. It was a lunatic asylum for a time, and the chap who ran the lunatic asylum did unauthorised lobotomies on some of his patients when he was experimenting. He apparently went nuts and he chucked himself off the tower. So it's said to be haunted. But he's not, what he said is, I'm not going to turn it into a theme park or anything, but I'm going to open it up to visitors. So I'm not sure what the strapline is going to be about where you'd go. But when the first set of reporters discovered the sale, and started looking into it, the boatman who took them to the island wouldn't set foot on it. He took them along to the jetty. He said, you jump off and give me a ring when you come back, because I'm off. Now, interestingly, Venice has the largest concentration of 5-star hotels in the world. You can pay up to €12,000 a night for a suite in some of these, the Danieli and Cipriani and the Excelsior and all the rest of them. And they are fabulous places. But it brings with it a consequence. The Venice Film Festival, Carnivale, and the Biennial, which is an art. It's not an exhibition, it's an art event that runs every couple of years and is wonderful. Churches, squares, there's art all over the city. Brings in a lot of very wealthy people. And in fact, if you do the arithmetic, the majority of the people who stay more than one night are the very wealthy. Because these are places that you could comfortably stay in, if you could afford it, for a week or a fortnight or whatever. And the consequence of these events and bringing very wealthy people in is this, that young people, it's like our big cities and many big cities around the world, our young people can no longer afford to live there. Property prices have gone through the roof. And I checked that out this morning, and I found a 1-bedroom studio apartment overlooking the Grand Canal on a property website for €950,000. And it's an attic bedsit, effectively, but fabulous views. And a 1-bedroom apartment, you're talking about $1 million or $1 million plus. So young people can't afford to live in the place. So you see, this is what's happening to younger people as a percentage of the population. They're coming down. And the people who are living there still are older people. And what's going to happen when they go? Their apartments or whatever it is will sell to much wealthier people. So younger people are being squeezed out. 12,000 people every day commute into Venice across the causeway. So it's a real lifeline in more than one respect. But they go home every evening. And so if you were staying in the apartment that we stayed in 2 years ago, in a couple of years' time, there might not be anybody dancing in the piazza. They'll have gone back across the causeway. So the place is in danger, really, of becoming something like Disneyland or a theme park or a human zoo almost. It's very sad, and it's difficult to see what they can do about this. So lots of parts of Venice I haven't talked about. I haven't mentioned Murano, many churches, most of the artists, most of the statuary. I haven't mentioned most of anything, frankly. I've been talking for an hour and I haven't said much. But my message would be, this is an example of the sort of art. You see some really extravagant art at the Biennial. You go any time of the year, you can go to an opera every night, you can go to a concert every night, there's something running somewhere in this hundreds and hundreds of churches and music schools. It's a very lively place to go at the moment, or it was 2 years ago. This is a big annual event where they all paddle around the Grand Canal and some of the other canals. So having listened to what I've said, if you're a pessimist, then you ought to go now, before it all changes. And if you're an optimist, go anyway. Thank you for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Well, Geoff, you've done it again. we've enjoyed a very well illustrated, informative talk. This time, of course, about the city of Venice. Those of us who have been there, I'm sure would have been happy to have had this information before going, and that would have added to the great excitement of visiting this beautiful place. Now, we have a few minutes for questions or comments. So if anybody would like to say something about this wonderful talk, please say so now. Dorothy.
I thought it was fascinating. Absolutely.
Thank you.
And there was one thing you mentioned, where lots of countries are joined in helping something.
Yes, they haven't so much joined in helping. The question is about the number of countries joined in helping raise money. They're raising money individually to contribute to the Venice in Peril Fund.
Because I noticed Ireland was mentioned,
Yes.
but not Scotland, England or Wales.
Well, that's probably because UNESCO, it comes from the Venice in Peril website, they probably think we're all the same.
Fair enough.
Anyone else?
Didn't mention the pigeons, Geoff.
Oh, the pigeons, yes. Well, there's too many of them in Porthcawl. They're trying to discourage, they're trying to...
Too many of them in Venice, and they look much scruffier than the Porthcawl ones.
Well, they're Italian. The question is about, are they doing anything about the pigeons? They're trying to, and they've tried all sorts of things like putting poison bird food down, and putting contraceptives in the seed. They've tried all sorts of things, but the problem is that tourists keep on feeding them, even though there are signs up saying don't do it, and they're terrific carriers of disease. I don't know what the rate of venereal disease is at the Carnivale now, but I should think the rate of disease from these guys is probably worse. But it's like London, isn't it? Like many other big cities, they've moved into the cities, and what can you do about them? If they try to shoot them, there'd be uproar. There'd be more countries united in preventing that than would be preventing the place flooding, probably. Yeah. But they're horribly disease-ridden.
Anyone else? I'm sure you've all enjoyed this talk as much as I have. It's been excellent, and we've learned a lot from it, and it's been very well presented. Now, if there are no questions or comments again, I'd like to call on Caroline. Caroline is in the back there somewhere. And Caroline, would you give us some vote of thanks, please?
Well, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you. Venice is probably on top of everybody's wish list. I'm very lucky to have been there a couple of times. We brought back a lot of happy memories for me.
But I've also learned an awful lot, Geoff, thank you. You've obviously done a huge amount of research, and you have a gentle way of imparting the facts, so they're very pleasurable. I'm not sure if your holiday 2 years ago was done with this talk in mind, but the illustrations and the information was most enlightening. Thank you.